to kind of introduce their respective organizations and how they fit into the puzzle. And then we're going to kind of launch into a discussion, and I'll have some questions, and they'll kind of have some questions, and that'll roll for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to do a solid question and answer session at the end for 30 minutes. So save your questions for the end. We'll have plenty of time to kind of give a rundown of those. I made this fancy slide today to hopefully help and aid in our discussion. So for those who haven't been following the reform efforts, I just wanted to provide a little context for what we're talking about today. So on the screen, we're looking at a couple slides. We have a bunch of acronyms on the left that may likely come up throughout the discussion, so just helping us keep track of those. And then we have a timeline of kind of where we are, how we got to where we are today. And I'm going to kind of run through this timeline briefly, but just good to have a little bit of context there. So yeah, as you can see, over the last 35 years, there's been an effort to get the 6 utilities along the Railbelt, that's from Homer to Fairbanks, working more closely together. Around 70 years ago, it made sense when all the utilities were popping up for them to function independently along the grid. There wasn't roads going between them, there weren't transmission lines, so it was logical to have your utility in charge of your area and look out just for the members that were living in that area. So as Alaska developed and as our infrastructure developed, we have roads going up and down between Homer and Fairbanks, along with transmission lines. So as the infrastructure has developed, the utilities stayed confined to their governance structures that they created when they were started. So even though everything is connected, they are still or still focused just on their one area, looking out for the best interest of their member owners. And they have a fiduciary responsibility to do that. So they are tied by their bylaws to be looking out for their interests. Okay, so as you can see through this timeline, 35 years ago there was efforts to connect the Railbelt utilities, and over the years there's been several iterations of committees formed throughout that process to work on that effort. And REAP has been involved for some time here, and we have been hosting negotiations and meetings with the utilities, trying to figure out how we can work together to better cohesively have one linked network from Fairbanks to Homer. So where that process is now is we're really close to having an entity that's going to be formed, a new entity that'll be formed, that'll be in charge of doing some regional planning for all these utilities. And that's sort of the next step in this process. And that's where we're going to be talking about today, is kind of what this entity might look like and how we're going to move forward from there. And we talk to the utilities all the time. They were at our board meeting last week, and they'll say themselves, and we agree that we're arguably closer than ever to having a more unified grid that'll greatly improve each of our missions respectively in accomplishing what we want to accomplish. So now, introduction for our panelists. Everybody up here is representing a organization, and they are all slightly different organizations, and we're going to hear about how these organizations each take an interest in this Railbelt electric grid reform and why it's important for our respective missions. So first, I'll introduce Phil White on the far side here. Phil is an environmental historian and is currently a Cooperative Energy Democracy Fellow. Phil completed his doctoral dissertation with Brandeis University on the environmental history of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, and he is currently the Renewable Energy Campaigner for the Fairbanks Climate Action Coalition. Next, Very DeSevero's background is in various advocacy areas, most recently Alaska Native Language Revitalization and Maintenance. Barry is the Executive Director of the Alaska Public Interest Research Group, or ACPIRG. And Chris Rose is the founder and executive director of REAP. And since he founded the organization, Chris has been working on advancing renewable energy in Alaska. Chris received his law degree from the University of Oregon, and for 12 years had a private law and mediation practice, including representation of Native Alaskans in the Northwest Arctic. Chris has filled various board and advisory roles, including the current chair of the state's Renewable Energy Grant Fund Advisory Committee, and he's also on the advisory committee for the Alaska Center for Power and Energy, for Energy. So I'll leave that for the introduction because we have lots to talk about, and I'll turn it over to our panelists to give just a 2-minute little background on your organization and why your organization's perspective is important in this conversation, why you have an interest in what we're talking about.
There we go. All right, well, thank you all for being here tonight, and I want to thank REAP for putting this on. As Greg said, my name is Philip White, and I'm here representing the Fairbanks Climate Action Coalition. So we are a grassroots organization that is working to address the root causes of climate change, and we are working to advance a just transition to a renewable and regenerative economy. As we do that process, we are very concerned that nobody gets left behind. I firmly believe that we are going to have a clean and renewable energy future. And the big question that's on my mind is, how are we going to get there, and how is it going to look like in terms of a just and equitable transition? So that's what we are squarely focused on. When it comes to the Railbelt, and when it comes to Railbelt unification, I'm a firm believer that based on our grid up in Fairbanks, GVA, that Railbelt unification is our greatest opportunity at decarbonization. We have limited, we have less availability of energy resources up in Fairbanks because we do not have access to large volumes of natural gas. And so because of that, the resources that we utilize to generate power, coal and oil, have a really tremendous climate impact. And so being able to not only be connected with the rest of the Railbelt, which obviously we are, but being able to have integrated resource planning, being able to use the tremendous hydro, natural gas, and wind resources of South Central Alaska is a tremendous opportunity for us, and ultimately where we need to be going for this clean energy future that it's knocking on our door, and the real question is, what are we going to do to answer that and meet the challenge and the opportunity of the future?
Thank you, Phil. Hi, everybody. My name is Barry Yusufero, and thank you also to REAP and also the Anchorage Museum for hosting. So ACPERG is a consumer advocacy organization that was started in 1974 and advocates generally in the public's interest and for consumer issues on behalf of consumers. And we do that because we're a member organization. And so, I think we've been involved in utilities and utility elections for a decade or more. But specifically with this issue, with integrated resource planning, and with this organization that's being stood up, ACPERG is we're really excited that this is happening because, utilities are member owned. And the other two utilities on the grid in the Railbelt region are MLNP and the Seward electric system. And they're public owned, right? And so each of these organizations are working on behalf of their members, but ACPERG represents the whole state. And so we represent consumers across the grid. And what is best in one utility area maybe isn't best for all the consumers that are tied to that grid. And so when we look at where the most impact can be made on creating affordable rates that are long-term affordable and stable, that looks like creating a grid system that's interconnected where cooperatives are cooperating together and ensuring that consumers have the best deal possible. So ACPERG's working both organizing member owners of co-ops to be talking with their utilities, and we're also working with the utilities who are really leading this charge and they, recognizing that this is a huge issue and something that's really exciting to be happening. And, in terms of impact, Chris always says that the Railbelt region uses 70% of the energy in Alaska. And so if we want to make the biggest impact in terms of how we are structuring or restructuring our grid, that's where we can make it. And so we're really excited to be involved.
Thanks, Farah. I also want to thank both you and Phil for being here, and to the museum, and for everyone coming here tonight. Renewable Energy Alaska Project is a coalition of about 80 organizations, and they include electric utilities both from the Railbelt region and outside of it, as well as a host of other types of stakeholders who care about renewable energy, from businesses and developers of renewable energy to native corporations to other NGOs and educational institutions. And so we actually represent a wide range of interests. We have a 21-member board, but our mission is to increase the production of renewable energy here in the state and promote energy efficiency. And so we kind of look at that in 4 buckets of things that we must do. Greg already mentioned a lot of the human capacity and STEM work that we're doing, because we got to have people who can operate and maintain these projects. He also mentioned the work we're doing on Green Bank to make sure that we have financing. Past work of REAP has included developing the Renewable Energy Grant Fund, which really helped do a lot of work out in rural Alaska. But we're past the grant period, so we're looking at ways to finance projects. Technology is another bucket, but we're not really technologists. We don't have engineers on board, so really we're convening people who are talking about technology. And the 4th bucket is policy. So I guess that's the interest that we have in this issue, is that what policy changes, programmatic and institutional changes, do we need to make sure that we have more renewable energy in the Railbelt grid? And there are a number of functions that we're hoping that this new institution will be able to provide that we don't have now as a region, that I think will help us get more renewable energy here in the future. And that's really the primary interest in REAP and being involved with.
Thank you. And Chris, I'll stay with you. There's a cluster of acronyms at the top of the page there: RRC, ERO, ISO, and MOU. And I was hoping you could just define, I mentioned a new entity that has been worked on, and I'm hoping you could just kind of briefly define what this new entity is, what it might look like, and how it relates to kind of the bigger picture here.
Sure. The ISO, Independent System Operator, is actually the acronym that the utilities brought to us almost 6 years ago. Several utilities said, hey, we need to create an independent system operator for the Railbelt. And I think all of us have morphed over that time, and including the utilities, to realizing that maybe that's not our first institution. But an independent system operator is something that's pretty common in the lower 48 now. It's an entity that will dispatch power for a region. So it would be not owning assets of the utilities, but actually controlling them, so that you can have balancing of supply and demand and dispatching of power in a larger region that might include several utilities, which is the situation we have here in the Railbelt. We have 6 utilities in this one region, but we have 6 load balancing areas. We have 6 different places where 6 utilities are respectively on a daily basis balancing their own supply and demand. And what we would like to see, what we were talking about when we talked about an independent system operator, is one regional balancing area. That would be much better for renewables for reasons I can get into. But over time, the discussion has morphed to creating, instead of an independent system operator off the bat, instead creating what's called an electric reliability organization. That's a generic name. There are electric reliability organizations in other parts of the country as well, and it focuses more on the non-technical functions. So it's an entity that really is more focused on creating and maintaining reliability standards, creating and maintaining interconnection standards, so independent power producers have non-discriminatory access to the grid, working on things like a regional transmission tariff, and perhaps most importantly, regional planning for both generation and transmission. So the Electric Reliability Organization is really the kind of entity that we've been talking about for the last couple of years, and the specific name that the Railbelt utilities have coined to call this new ERO is the Railbelt Reliability Council. So the RRC and ERO are basically the same thing. One just has a specific name to define it as a Railbelt entity. The MOU is simply a memorandum of understanding that the utilities, and other stakeholders have been working on for some time, more than a year, to define the parameters of what this RRC or ERO is actually going to do, and how we would govern it, and what the process of putting it up, standing it up would be.
Thank you. How's that for everybody? Is that getting on the same page here? Making sense? So I guess a question for all of you, maybe we can start with Barry, is just kind of assuming this RRC is formed in the near future, I'm just curious how this organization is going to affect your constituency and how you hope to interact with it. So obviously, Barry, from a consumer perspective, Phil, you mentioned some of the energy challenges in Fairbanks, and then maybe after that, Chris, you can mention how it's going to specifically affect renewable energy.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so in terms of our consumers on the Railbelt, it's going to affect the ways in which they're able to engage with the power decisions that are being made. All right, it's another forum that would allow stakeholder input and be able to sort of elevate some of the discussions that people are maybe having within their one cooperative to a level that has, you know, greater flexibility to plan where energy is distributed and how that, you know, affects rates, which it would lower them. So that's, the spoiler has been spoiled, but it's a really exciting opportunity for consumers as individuals to give input, but also, you know, the current structure of this board is really exciting because the utilities that are a part of this Railbelt system are not the only users of it. Chris mentioned independent power producers, and they're just one example. There's also the Alaska Energy Authority that owns some of the transmission lines that help the grid operate. And other players in that are consumers. And so right now, as part of the proposed MOU, there's a consumer seat at the table. And so ACPERG is hoping to be that consumer representative so we can help host consumer forums and continue to do that outreach and education that we've been doing for member owners right now. But really, you know, supporting the organizations that are a part of it is one of our key missions going forward to, you know, continue to be part of this conversation. So we're really excited about it and excited that it's going to happen.
Yeah, thanks, Barry. So from a climate perspective and from a Fairbanks perspective, you know, we're hoping that this new RRC, this new ERO will accomplish a number of things. So the first of which is we don't really want to see any more new fossil generation built in the interior. If you look at the state of Alaska as a whole, we have plenty of fossil generation. I mean, South Central, the amount of natural gas capacity down here is more than sufficient. So we should be able to rely on that in the interior and, you know, not be building any new fossil generation. The second thing is, you know, we're really enthusiastic about this because of the ability of independent power producers to add new renewable generation to the grid. Whether that's wind, whether that's solar, it would be amazing if we could get some geothermal on our grid up in Fairbanks. All of those things are really important, and again, it's this regional planning perspective that makes sure that you're not sinking money into projects that A, are not going to be economic in the future, and B, that are harming our climate system today and in the future. And the final thing I'll say is just to Barry's point, you know, we're hoping this more integrated perspective, this greater unification of the Railbelt will help with rates. I mean, we have some of the most expensive rates, you know, in all of Alaska, certainly, and in all of the nation up in Fairbanks, at 23 cents per kilowatt hour. And so we're really hoping this new unification can help stabilize and potentially even bring down rates over time, especially as we're putting more renewable generation on the grid.
I'm going to add on to that. Sorry, I'm stealing your mic. But I just, to your point, just to make it more tangible about, you know, one way that this could lower rates was the regional planning that Chris was talking about. And in the past decade, 4 co-ops have built generation facilities that are natural gas run, but that has cost consumers $1.49 billion roughly. And we are a population that could be served by roughly 1/2 of a power plant in the lower 48. And that, our state is different and the geographies are different, but the fact that there are 4 new plants on the grid when there didn't need to be, and we're now overbuilt in a way that, we're still operating with efficiency, but that doesn't mean that we could have planned it differently if we were doing regional rather than just co-op specific planning. So that's one way in which rates could go down, is by there not being overbuilding in different ways on this grid.
We believe this new institution is going to just knock down a lot of barriers that currently exist for renewables. I can just run through a few of them. Right now, for instance, each of the 6 utilities has their own interconnection protocols for independent power producers to get on the grid. So if we want to invite the industry writ large to Alaska, we have to expect them to have all these transaction costs of trying to remember and figure out which of these 6 utilities has which protocols to connect. Well, that's not going to happen. Another problem that we've got, and this is for fossil and renewable energy, is we've got a transmission tariff system that allows each of the 6 utilities and the state of Alaska that owns any portion of the transmission system to charge a tariff or a fee for electrons that move through their system. So if you have to move power from one end to the Railbelt to the other, you might move through 2, 3, or 4 different systems and pay 2 or 3 or 4 different transmission tariffs. So the pancaking of tariffs, as we call it, stacking of tariffs, is a problem that we hope that we can work out. The reliability standards that the Regulatory Commission has really pushed on hard, that the utilities have now agreed to, that would be promulgated into regulation and would be overseen by this, will also, I believe, help reduce some of the barriers that we've got. And having a larger balancing area, which is not necessarily part of the current plan. The current plan is to talk about a larger balancing area and economic dispatch after this new institution is set up. But if we have a larger balancing area, it'll do it'll do at least one thing, which is allow for electrons that are being now, for instance, off-taken by just one utility to go to another utility if that utility can't use them at the moment that they're produced. Chugach Electric and Fire Island's a great example. They've had to, in the past, curtail some of their power that they could have produced with wind turbines because Chugach couldn't take it at that moment. And yet, if we had a bigger balancing area, it's possible that those electrons could have moved to one of the other utilities in the Railbelt region. And economies of scale is a big thing, too. We don't have a big population here, 500,000 people in the Railbelt. And so if we have bigger projects that are regionally developed and planned for, it's real possible that we might be able to develop the larger kinds of wind projects, for instance, that we see in the lower 48 all the time, that are some of the cheapest power on the planet. Now, the cheapest power you can get on the planet right now is land-based wind. The average power purchase agreement, even without the subsidy, the power production tax credit in the Midwest where I'm from, is about 4 cents a kilowatt hour. So that means 4 cents a kilowatt hour to make wind power in the Midwest, and it's costing our utilities who are running on natural gas 6, 7, 8 cents a kilowatt hour to make power with natural gas. So we know that renewables are cheaper. We know consumer preferences are changing. We know technology is evolving. We know carbon policy is coming. We have to have this new institution to be prepared.
The time is 6 p.m. and the Anchorage Museum is now closed. Once again, the time is 6 p.m. and the Anchorage Museum is now closed. Thank you for coming, and we hope you visit again soon.
Perfect time. So I thank you all for those responses. I think obviously there's a lot at stake from each of your perspectives. This one institution can play a big role in how we move forward with our energy in Alaska. I want to backtrack a little bit to our timeline, and while you have the microphone, Chris, there's a couple pieces of legislation up there on the timeline, and I know there's a couple that have been introduced in the last session. So I was wondering if you could just touch on quickly what those pieces of legislation are and how they are going to play a role in the process of creating this new entity and moving forward.
Sure, just going back to 2015 and 2018, in those years, right after this latest iteration of reform effort started, we got bills introduced both years in the House and had them heard that would have created an independent system operator. And I think the difference between that legislation and what I'll talk about, which has been just introduced this year, is that legislation in both those years was much more prescriptive as to what an independent system operator would look like, what the governance structure would look like, what the functions were going to be. And it was also an independent system operator that included economic dispatch for the entire region. As I said before, we are now at least temporarily agreeing to put off the issue of economic dispatch and let this new entity, when it gets stood up, work on that. But the new idea for the ERO is to allow all the stakeholders, including the utilities, to voluntarily develop this electric reliability organization. Now, the commission, the regulatory commission, asked the utilities to start doing that back in a letter that they wrote to the legislature on June 30th, 2015. And that's an important document, a milestone document in this latest iteration of the reform effort, because the commission made several findings and recommendations at the time. But instead of saying you have to do it by the end of 2016 or whatever, they just said, we're going to give you some amount of time. And here we are, almost 2020, it's still not done. And yet we are really close. So like I think all of us have said, we believe that the negotiations to create this memorandum of understanding, to get the process going, to voluntarily develop this thing, is moving forward. However, given the fact that we have 35 years of effort that has not produced a new institution, as a backstop, we were able to introduce legislation in May, both the House and the Senate, House Bill 151 and Senate Bill 123, that does two things. Number one, the legislation gives specific statutory authority to the Regulatory Commission to oversee this new ERO, assuming it stood up voluntarily. Because there's been some legal disagreement about whether or not the RCA actually has that authority. We're just going to make it clear in the statute that they do. Second, and I think more importantly, what the statute would allow the RCA to do if these voluntary efforts fail is to set up the ERO itself. And so basically we would finally have something in statute that says, Regulatory Commission, the legislature is directing you to set up this new institution. So that legislation's pending. It got introduced at the very end of the session, so there's no time for hearings. We have one more year left in this session. We expect hearings to begin on this relatively soon after the session starts, and we will continue to push on that legislation, because even if we do succeed with the voluntary effort to set up an ERO, we still have to get at least part of that legislation passed to make sure that that the commission has the authority to oversee it.
So we don't have the utilities on stage here, but everybody's been working hard on a voluntary effort to move this process forward. So if this was a chess match, the legislation would be, a key piece on the board. Maybe not the queen, but it would be a key piece that's kind of keeping things in check here. And one last question for you, Chris, just to help me segue. So as consumers and as voters, what role can we play if we want clean energy on our grid and we want this RRC to move forward? Knowing that this legislation has been introduced, what role can we play as voters in keeping this piece on the chessboard?
Well, I think letting your legislator know that legislators, your House member and your Senate member, know that you support these bills is important. I think that there is over time now been a large education effort in the legislature for why this is important. I think a lot of people understand it. So it would be really, I think, important for them to hear from constituents, and that for them to understand their constituents understand it. Matanuska Electric Association has already wrote a letter in support of this legislation to the governor and copied the legislature. We would love to see the other utilities write letters of support for this legislation to show good faith that this effort is really moving forward. We'd love to see, for instance, Chugach Electric, Golden Valley, and the other utilities in the Railbelt send a letter to the governor, very similar to the one that MEA sent. Tell your local co-op board members that you support this effort to have a regional institution. And I think those are all things that people can do.
Great, thank you. And so, to segue, Barry, I know you and ACPERG have been working a lot on this, so I'm just curious to hear what you guys have been working on, and what other organizations you've been working with, and maybe some of the successes of some of the things that you've been doing so far.
Yeah, happy to talk about our success. Well, I think along the lines of what you're talking about, Chris, is like voting. One of the big things that people can do when they're part of a co-op is vote. And that's vote for their board members and vote for those elections that come up. So by a show of hands, who here is a member of a co-op, electric co-op? Hey, wow, that's really exciting. So you're going to change the board elections next year, right? I'm kidding. But I think one of the biggest ways that ACBERG has identified, showing support for this RRC and generally for a region-wide effort towards, more collective decision-making as consumers is working with boards. And going to board meetings. Also, there are a bunch of committees that each co-op has. So there's something along the lines of a re-election committee that board members can run to be a part of. There's bylaws committees. There's just a bunch of places in which to insert oneself into a cooperative and to be part of that decision making. And so what ACBERG has been doing is hosting information sessions where we talk about the RRC. We hosted one in Talkeetna on Tuesday, and MEA we were fortunate to have them there, and they sort of gave a rundown of what it looks like to engage with MEA and opportunities to get involved. And so, working with local co-ops to make sure that member owners are connected with people in the co-ops, to make sure that people are aware of the opportunities that are coming up. That's one huge thing that ACBERG is trying to do. We have a great name for it. It's called Empowering Democracy. So I am really pleased with that. And we're having another session in Wasilla on November 18th. And the reason we're hosting them in Talkeetna and Wasilla respectively is because this year the two board seats that are up for election are in those two places, and we want to make sure that member owners, when they're voting, are voting with full knowledge of what the issues on the table are. And the RRC is just one of them, and there's a bunch that I think we might talk a little bit more about, but going to board meetings is one of the key pieces there. And I think Phil has been doing a ton of work on that, so I will pass the mic.
Yeah, Phil, I know the Fairbanks Climate Action Coalition has done a lot of work engaging with the Golden Valley Electric Association. So yeah, very interested to hear of what's been working for you guys up there, but also maybe what are some of the challenges or what could be you guys could be doing better or other people could be doing better as well.
Well, just to build off of what Barry was saying, it's really essential fundamental knowledge that we are all member owners of our co-op, right? They're our institutions. We own them, and we should be part of their. Obviously, we should be part of their elections, but they're also, especially up in the interior with GVA, there's any number of opportunities to engage with your co-op and to be a part of them. So up at GVA, we have MAC, the Member Advisory Committee, which allows you, they have monthly meetings, you get to learn more about the co-op, you get to tour their facilities. We also have nomination committees. So every year or whenever the elections are occurring, they have these nomination committees which put forward the most qualified candidates. And I believe that they have similar types of boards down here at MEA and other Railbelt co-ops. And so these are all opportunities for you to learn more about the co-op and make sure that the democratic process is functioning smoothly. We, as the Fairbanks Climate Action Coalition, have been very... there are a lot of folks in Fairbanks who are very concerned about the climate crisis. They can see it with their eyes, and they want to change our power system. GVA, because of some of these resource challenges that we face, we have the most, we have the dirtiest grid, basically, because we burn so much coal, because we burn so much oil. We also have the most renewables out of any grid, but that just shows, some of the resource challenges that we're facing. And so folks come to us and they say, what can we do? Where are the areas of engagement? And so when it comes to our board, we've really been advocating for pro-renewable candidates to be on the board. We have tried to support their elections. And, most of all, we've tried to educate people. It's really remarkable when you talk to folks, how many folks do not understand that they are part of a co-op and that they have a vote and that what's going on with their co-op fundamentally reflects that democratic process. And just as a historian, I think it's interesting to note that electric co-ops emerged out of market failure. These institutions emerged in the 1920s and 1930s because private electric producers were unwilling to provide electricity for rural regions. And so when we think about the climate crisis, as Lord Nicholas Stern has said, this is the greatest single market failure in human civilization. The inability to price carbon. And so I actually think co-ops are uniquely suited to deal with the climate crisis and overcome that because they've already been born out of one market failure. And so it's time that they help address the next market failure.
That's really interesting, Phil. You can hang on to the mic because I have a follow-up question here. So where else in the country are there co-ops? How many are there, and what are they doing? Are they working well? Are they functioning similar to ours, or are they functioning better or worse? Are they doing and how does that relate to bringing on cleaner energy to their grids?
Yeah. So I want to say the number is something like 863, but it's around 900 rural electric co-ops in the nation. And again, these are legacy from the 1930s, the 1940s, the need to bring electricity to rural residents, and it really transformed their life. And so if we look at what's happening up here in Alaska, when we look at GBA and other co-ops up here, compared to the lower 48, I would say that we see two things. Overall, I'm generally impressed by the governance of our co-ops and the accountability of our co-ops to their membership. If you go down to the lower 48, you hear some really terrible stories of mismanagement, of graft. I mean, because these are legacy institutions and a lot of folks don't realize that they're democratic organizations, you've kind of, to be honest, got these good old boys down in different lower 48 co-ops who are not managing the co-op's assets very well. And so we are fortunate, I can especially speak as a Golden Valley member owner, that regardless of what concerns we might have about our fuel mix and climate emissions, that our board is very responsive to its member owners, that we have transparency, that we have accountability. So I actually think we're starting from a great place to begin advocating for the decarbonization of our fuel supply and electricity generation.
Well, the other thing I'd add is in the lower 48, most co-ops don't generate power anymore. In the lower 48, most co-ops are distribution co-ops. And so we're also unique in that we've got not larger, but co-ops that are also generating power, so they're vertically integrated, and they're regulated for that reason. Most co-ops in the lower 48 are regulated.
Interesting. So shifting gears a little bit, I'm just curious, so I've heard about that we have sort of a capacity of generation right now that we're at. And I'm curious, maybe for Chris first, looking forward, what renewable opportunities there are for the grid. So we get the RRC passed, but it sounds like we have enough generation right now. How and where are we going to introduce more renewable energy?
Well, my co-op is Metnis Electric. I'm really happy with what they've been doing in these negotiations. Like I said, they have recently written a letter in support of the legislation. However, it's the largest co-op by geography, and as far as I know, they have not put up one anemometer yet in this region that is huge to see what our wind resources are. And I know that we have wind out there, and most of the time it's too windy, it's too gusty, but we just have to look first. The utilities outside of this grid have been looking for their renewable resources for some time because they are relying on very, very expensive diesel. And so they have had, Alaska Energy Authorities have an anemometer loan program. They've been really after finding out where the resources are. There certainly are other potential resources. There's a geothermal resource that the state leased several years ago that could have potentially reached the Railbelt grid. It's not that far from the grid over Beluga, Mount Spur. At that point, though, the state refused to continue to cost share on the exploration drilling for that project, which is ironic since we cost share on exploration drilling for oil and gas all the time. But this is one of the fundamental problems we've got in the state is we have the mentality, we think we have an energy policy, but really what it is, it's a development policy for oil and gas. We have no energy policy when it comes to figuring out whether or not Alaskans who live here are going to be able to produce and consume energy affordably. So it's just a mind shift. I mean, there are lots of resources in this tremendously large geographic area, but we'd have to start looking for them. And the other thing to mention is that the utilities don't even have to do that. There are independent power producers that are out there. There are entrepreneurs out there who want to do that. And if we can level the playing field for those entrepreneurs and remove some of the barriers and do things like have a standardized transmission tariff, it'll be a lot easier for those entrepreneurs, that private sector, to take the risk and then just offer the power for sale to the utilities, which is how it's done in the lower 48. 40% of the power in the lower 48 is produced by independent power producers.
And those barriers, we're thinking, can be broken down through this RRC. Is that the idea?
Yes, interconnection standards, transmission tariffs are certainly a couple of the big ones that we need to address right up front. And then having a planning process that allows stakeholders besides just the utilities to talk about what other resources there might be out there, rather than just doing the easy thing, which is build natural gas generation and pass the costs on to your consumer, no matter what the gas cost is. You know, the utilities in the Railbelt, despite the fact that we're producing natural gas 50 miles away from Anchorage, are paying almost 3 times as much for natural gas as utilities in the lower 48 are paying for natural gas. So we're not getting a hometown discount for our gas. We're paying quite a lot for it. And perhaps that discussion would have occurred had we had some kind of a planning discussion before the $1.5 billion in natural gas generation got built.
So just in terms of other types of resources and other ways we can envision what our production and generation looks like, in Talkeetna, one of the presenters was Kristen Collins, who works with the Alaska Center on Solarize Anchorage, which some of you may have heard of, but it's working with communities at the community level to put solar and buying in bulk, reduces costs, but it requires, or it allows for selling back to the grid through net metering projects. But there's also other types of projects that can be stood up by communities that can lower costs for people who could be renters, who could not, maybe aren't able to afford the $11,000 you need to have up front to buy a solar panel. So that looks like community solar, and it looks like, figuring out ways that aren't going to be cost prohibitive to make sure that when we do move forward through energy transitions and through cost destabilization of oil and gas, that there is stability, that there is planning, which is, as a consumer rep, like that's what we're all about. It's hard as a consumer to not know what to plan for in terms of cost for the next month, the next year, or the next 10. And so having this planning process and also thinking through other ways of sharing energy and creating energy, that's the dream.
So while you have the mic, or yeah, go ahead.
Just a couple more.
Yeah.
So at FCAC, we are launching a Solarize Fairbanks campaign right now, modeled off of Solarize Anchorage. We don't like to admit that we're following the lead very often, but y'all did a great job down here. But we actually have better solar resources in the interior, and so we are trying to capitalize off of those. Right? This is healthy competition. Let's make it happen. The other thing I'd say is we have world-class wind resources in the interior. If you look at Delta Junction, if you look at Healy and the wind that's blowing through there, it's absolutely phenomenal. So we can envision a future of large-scale wind resources with battery backup, with greater grid interconnection, where we're really decarbonizing the system. And I'm very enthusiastic and bullish about that future. It's going to bring a lot of jobs to our region. And the other thing I'd say is, kind of big picture, we want greater interconnection. We want, electrons moving back and forth much more easily without these tariffs. But if you look at what's happening with climate change, and if you look at what's happening with destabilization and what's happening in California, I also think we need to think about what resiliency means for Alaska. And from our perspective up in the interior, what I'd really like to see is a lot more residential PV but also storage as part of that. Using mechanisms like on-bill financing, because we not only need greater interconnection, but we need greater resiliency within our communities. And what that exactly is going to look like going forward, I'm not sure, but it's an uncertain future that we're heading into, and we need to make sure that our electricity resources are prepared for that future.
I guess I'd add one more thing about supply, and that is a lot of communities around the world are now looking at this concept of beneficial electrification, which is essentially electrify everything. And we've talked about this at other forums. The world and many consumers and auto companies are moving to electric vehicles. There's maybe a $700 million gasoline market here just between Homer and Fairbanks. In other words, we're spending $700 million a year on gas that we're then exporting most of those dollars out of the community. We have a big heating issue in places like Fairbanks and even down here. We're not necessarily getting, again, the best deal on natural gas. There are ways for us to conceive of using renewables for both heating and transportation. And at that point, you're talking about a much bigger electric pie than we've got right now. And so there might be a need for using all the natural gas we've got and a lot more renewables. But right now, we have such a tremendous amount of generation capacity. It is going to be a little bit it's going to be a little bit difficult to figure out where renewables fit in right now, unless we have larger projects that I think they'll have better economies of scale.
So if we are electrifying more, we hear a lot about targets and percentages of renewables or clean energy that we want to hit by a certain year. States and organizations are calling out 100% renewable as a goal. Maybe Phil, can you first speak to, let's take the most extreme 100% renewable energy. What does that look like here along the Railbelt? Is that something that's possible from your perspective on Fairbanks?
Yeah, I don't think it's extreme. I think it's what we have to do, right? And if you look at the renewable energy resources in Alaska, it's not like we lack resources up here, right? I think fossil fuels have made us lazy when it comes to this sort of stuff. And so if I'm envisioning a decarbonized grid in 2050, it's those world-class wind resources that we're talking about. If you've looked at the pace of innovation and the way that the price has fallen for renewables and battery storage, and you're seeing these power purchase agreements that are coming out of the lower 48, they are now deploying hybrid wind, solar, and battery projects for something like 3 cents per kilowatt hour. I mean, it's really remarkable. And so I can envision that. I think geothermal has to be part of Fairbanks' decarbonized future because, again, this isn't just about electricity, it's also about heat. And we, the dwellers of the North, we need warm dwellings, right? There's no doubt about that. And so, I'm bullish about the growth of this industry. If you see what's happening in the lower 48, the real question is, how are we going to take advantage of it? What are we going to do with it? And the other thing I'd say is, there are some long-term systemic risks with our fossil fuel assets. So just look at natural gas in the Cook Inlet, and look at the development of that and the types of costs that we've had to bear in order to sustain those resources. So whether you're thinking about the endangered beluga whales, whether you're talking about the release of methane from some of those Broken Hill Court pipelines, these are all costs of our energy system, and we need to ask ourselves, what our values are, and ultimately what are we willing to bear. But again, I believe that the 100% renewable future is not only possible, it is essential.
So yeah, same to you, Barry. What, from your perspective, from ACPERG, from a consumer perspective, what does 100% renewable Railbelt look like?
That's a great question. And I'd say I'm not an energy expert. And so the only way that ACPERG can participate in that discussion is if there's a planning team, right, of everyone in the Railbelt working together. The only way that we're going to be able to buy large enough scale renewable is if we have multiple entities working together. So maybe that's all of the utilities, maybe it's the entire Railbelt Reliability Council, but it needs to be a multi-entity effort. And when it comes to consumer interests, it's all about planning and stability, right? So the only way we're getting to 2050 with a bright energy future is by having a plan and by starting as soon as possible.
I would add to what Phil was saying about cost of Cook Inlet. We have subsidized Cook Inlet gas quite a bit. The state of Alaska has basically kept producers there because we now are hooked on natural gas. So we need this natural gas to be here, because the reason we're paying 3 times what the lower 48 is paying is we have a small market. And our market's not growing very fast. In fact, it's decreasing right now. That's why we need to expand the pie and start using electricity for things like transportation and heat. The 100% renewable policies in other states and other countries are driving technological innovation. So that's going to help us, because these technologies will just continue to get cheaper. As Phil mentioned, we've seen an 80% drop in the price of solar over the last 10 years, a 60% drop in the price of wind, and that's just going to keep going down. With fossil fuels, we have no idea what the cost is going to be. It's volatile. And so that's a problem. But the other thing about the policies is that it's also going to drive competition for investment. And I can already see that. In my home state of Iowa, for instance, and states like Colorado that went in with wind early, they have gotten tons of manufacturing jobs. They have gotten people like Apple to come to their state to invest because of the cheap electricity. And if Alaska just stands still and doesn't consider what policy changes we need, we will definitely get left behind when it comes to which states are going to get invested in. And it'll be a true shame, not only for us, but because we do have all these resources. We're just not thinking of them. As I said before, we have an oil and gas veil over our face. It's been really good for 40 years, but that will not last forever. And it's really made it difficult for us to see all the other options we have.
Thank you. Yeah, so we've got a couple minutes left before we'll open up to question and answer, and I want to do one more question for everybody to kind of run down the line. So looking at our timeline here, it might be a little hard to see, but we did put a 2020 year on here, and there are some things on the horizon. So I'm just curious, kind of some specific milestones that you're looking forward to from your organization's perspective, and what are some things that we as consumers, as voters, as member owners can keep our eye out to kind of clue us in that the process is checking, clicking along successfully, assuming that we're not, getting all the RCA hearing notifications in our inbox every day.
I guess I'll start because I got the mic. And first, the answer to the question of how would you find out, please check our website. If something's not there and you're interested, and just call us and ask. But there are 4 things that we anticipate happening in early 2020. And maybe some of them will even happen before the end of the year. But one of them is we actually stand up this implementation committee that we've been talking about for more than a year. That would be composed of 12 different entities that would become the originating governing board of this Railbelt Reliability Council. So we're hoping that voluntary effort will happen very quickly. Another thing that we're hoping will happen very soon is the RCA will send a long-awaited report to the legislature. It's the final report on this docket, this information docket 15001 that they opened back in 2015 when they made their findings and recommendations. And they basically have been saying for 6 or 7 months, legislature, we're about to send you something. They still haven't done that, in large part because they've been busy with another item that's up there, which is the acquisition of MLP by Chugach. We do expect a decision on that sometime in February. And then the last thing that's up there in 2020 is the legislation that I talked about before. We are going to actively work on that legislation, and we hope to get it passed by May.
ACPERG will be tracking along with REAP all of those things, and I think what I'm most excited for are these consumer forums, these Empowering Democracy series, where we're able to let you know. So how do you look out for it? Sign up for the RCA for sure, but if you also have other better things to do with your time, we're going to be hosting some forums all over the Railbelt region, and FCAC is going to be doing that as well. I'm sure you already are. But like having those forums where we're able to engage with hopefully utility staff and board members who are going to be there to be able to answer questions and to be able to engage more in what each co-op is doing, as well as what's going on the larger state and regional policy level. That's what ACPERG is going to be looking out to do, is making sure everybody knows what's going on, or at least knows that something is going on.
Barry, do you have those empowering democracy? Do you have ones on the schedule? I think I saw one in Wasilla coming up. Is there? What
There's
do you
a
have?
November 18th one, and then there's nothing else firmly scheduled, but definitely in the next couple of months there's going to be some other events.
Yeah, certainly FCAC is looking forward to this MOU being signed, really looking forward to this RRC being stood up, seeing how that process is going to actually unfold and get us to where we need to be in terms of unification. The other thing we're really looking forward to is we have GBA board elections this spring, so we are really looking forward to helping retain our renewable energy champions that we have on the board, and potentially, adding another renewable energy champion to make sure that our board is pro-renewables all the way. The final thing I would add is we're also hoping to convene what we're calling a solutions summit up in Fairbanks. We want to envision what a decarbonized Railbelt grid looks like in 2050. We want to think about how do we get there, and that's going to be a participatory convening where we hopefully are bringing together members of GBA. All throughout Alaska we have the most incredible, talented engineers, including folks who work in the oil and gas space, right? Like, we need folks with drilling companies drilling geothermal wells here in the state, right? We just have incredible expertise. Bringing them all to the table, envisioning what this process might look like, and thinking about what can we do today to begin realizing that future.
Thank you. Yeah, so definitely a few bullet points I didn't get to, so lots more to discuss, but want to give plenty of time for question and answers. So maybe we can pass a mic around, and if anybody has questions, you can take this one, Colin. Yeah, just raise your hand.
You mentioned the geothermal in Fairbanks, so you evidently have reason to believe that there's a lot nearby. Is that the case?
Well, there's two things I'd say to that. It's not like we have world-class geothermal resources within Fairbanks itself. Obviously, we have resources like Cheetah Hot Springs, but that's a fairly, it's a very low temperature geothermal resource, and it's not necessarily ideally suited for any type of utility scale applications. If you go out far enough, the resources are certainly there in the interior. It becomes a question of cost and economics about delivering that resource, whether it's high transmission lines or whether you are piping steam heating in from those locations. But again, as we think about what economists call the externalities of fossil fuels, all of these prices that we're not paying, and as we begin to think about what happens when we have a carbon tax on the oil that we're using to heat our homes or to create electricity, suddenly those resources look a lot more viable. And so I'm really thinking out to 2030, 2040, and I'm thinking about what does a decarbonized grid look like where you want to rely on low carbon heating sources, and where would you derive those from? And certainly geothermal is one of those options. The other thing I've been told, and I'm not an engineer, is if you drill down far enough, you can access those resources. Again, it's a question of cost, and it's a question of economics and how we're valuing these things. But I'd also go back to, we have world-class drilling companies in Fairbanks. Let's put them to work on the type of future that we really need and is really going to provide the most long-term value for Alaskans.
This is Steve Conkle. Thank you very much for that. I think it's very useful to get used to the French, the alphabet soup of acronyms, and this timeline. And it strikes me, this is just a question I have that I think I should have known the answer to. Is 1986, is that the year the Renewable Energy Fund was?
Railbelt.
Railbelt. So, and what's the difference in that and the Renewable Energy Fund and the experience with the Renewable Energy Fund? Would you say that was significant, fiscally in terms of our either goals or our actual appropriations?
Well, the Railbelt Energy Fund was a pot of money that the legislature put together in order to incentivize the utilities to work together. So it was used for projects in the rail belt. The Renewable Energy Fund was something REAP worked on to get passed in 2008. And the legislature put about $270 million into that over 10 years. That leveraged another $300 or $400 million in private and federal money and built about 80 projects, mostly in rural Alaska. So there's quite a difference. Yeah. Yep.
Are there any studies that show how people employed by fossil fuels can transition into a clean energy economy? And if so, like, are there any efforts to educate those people on why they won't lose their job once the oil, people stop drilling for fossil fuels?
Yeah, there's definitely some studies out there. We've looked at a few different ones, whether it comes to coal miners in Appalachia and Wyoming, or whether that's transitioning folks who worked on the North Sea oil and gas resources in the United Kingdom region and getting them to work on wind resources. I'd say there's still a tremendous amount to be done in order to educate folks about the potentials in the renewable energy industry and really the future of jobs in the state. And I'd say that's one of the foundational goals of FCAC is we don't want to leave anybody behind in this. And if you're going to work on the North Slope, if you're working on the pipelines, if you're working in Healy to produce fossil resources or to maintain fossil resources because you're providing for your family, that's just what we all do in our jobs, right? We want to make sure those folks have a future. And again, the expertise that those engineers are bringing to the table is absolutely indispensable for the type of future that we need to build. So I'd like to see more education efforts. I'd like to see more outreach efforts. And I think what a lot of folks don't understand is this is actually part and parcel of Alaskan history. So if you look at Governor Jay Hammond, the reason that he created the permanent fund was to create, to have a nest egg for Alaska beyond oil. That's why he created the permanent fund, and we forget that these days, right? So it's all about cultivating and enhancing the renewable resources in the state, which I'd argue is why most of us are here.
Just to add to that, I think part of when we talk about moving towards a different energy future, jobs are such a huge part of that, and the affordability of everyone to be able to move to that future is such a huge issue that sometimes gets overlooked when we're developing these and prototyping these, new energies that aren't affordable for all. And the working piece of that is what, a regular, or what I envision having a Railbelt Reliability Council being able to do, right? Being able to help with planning when it comes to infrastructure changes, right? IBEW, if we're electrifying everything, is going to have a lot more jobs available, but it takes the training and the understanding of where we're going to be able to start understanding what jobs we are going to actually even need. And I think that there's going to be that planning component of it is where we're at right now because we don't have all the information of, for coal workers in Appalachia, there's a lot of information on what to do, and that's a really good starting point, but we need to know a lot more.
Hi. First of all, I work for a Magic Electric Association, so just so I may not be biased. But it is a co-op, and part of that co-op is there's monthly meetings of the board that are open to the public. So if people want to get involved with the utility, I would suggest that, there's a website that I'm sure each co-op has that publishes when those meetings are and what the agendas are and allows people to get involved through that process. And we cry for more member input. I mean, we give away a pickup at our annual meetings just so people will show up. And now, admittedly, it's a retired pickup that we don't learn anymore, but it's safe. We wouldn't get it. So it is a co-op. It's member-owned. So we do look for member involvement.
Thanks, Ed.
I would just say this. I look forward to the day when you can give away an electric car to your friends.
So is the RRC, is that a steering council or an advisory council, or is it actually going to be a decision-making council?
It'd be a planning and decision-making council. That, I mean, in some areas, right? Because the big balance there is retaining local control of individual co-ops and utilities for, you know, what projects are going to be built and for local operation and generation and transmission. But the planning commission or the RRC would be developing the reliability standards and would also hold the transmission tariff. And so that would be, it would be an entity that would be overseen by the regulatory commission and that would be able to help the utilities understand what their planning and their long-term planning would look like.
Well, I guess I would add to that, there'd be a regulatory compact between the RRC and the Regulatory Commission. So the decisions of the RRC would be binding decisions, and there would be an appeal process to the RCA. The implementation committee that is about to be set up, we hope, will resolve a lot of these issues. The MOU only really draws a rough parameter around the functions of this thing, and I think there's a lot of the questions that you asked are not exactly answered and will be answered in the evolution of the implementation committee toward creating this thing. But the idea is, at least in my mind, the way I kind of think of it is that the RCA will farm out some of the responsibility for electric regulation to this new entity. They would still have ultimate authority over the decisions that the RRC makes, but it would allow the commission to have a little bit more hands-off on some of these questions that they now really have to spend a lot of time on.
Chris, why don't you mention the 6 versus 6 balance board for the RRC? I think that would help people understand it.
Sure. Thanks, Tom. So right now, the RRC MOU contemplates a 12-member governing board that will be composed of the 6 utilities. Now, if MLP goes away, there'll be 5. It'll be parity no matter what. 5 non-utilities, 5 utilities. If that were the case, or we might add another utility from the outside. But there would be 6 and 6, and right now the idea is to have 2 independent power producers who choose themselves through the Independent Power Producers Association, Alaska Independent Power Producers Association, the Alaska Energy Authority, a consumer-oriented group, and 2 unaffiliated groups that work in this area and have an interest in it. So those would be the 6 non-utility members, and then when this entity gets a CEO, the CEO would be the tie-breaking vote if there ever was a tie.
You mentioned independent power producers. Who are they now, and how much of the production of the electricity do they represent?
Some examples, Ceres, an independent power producer that owns Fire Island. Alaska Environmental Power has a small wind farm that sells power to Golden Valley up by Delta. Ocean Renewable Power Company, which was mentioned before, who will be at our event 2 weeks from tonight, is a tidal energy and hydrokinetic company. They're clearly an independent power producer that would be needed here if we were to develop tidal, because they have an expertise that the utilities just don't have. There's an independent power producer down in southeast Alaska, Juneau Hydropower, which is developing or beginning to develop a hydropower project down there. So there's not that many right now, and part of it is I think we don't have, first, a big market, and second, market rules that would attract them. But when ORMAT, for instance, was looking at the geothermal power production over at Mount Spur, they would have been another independent power producer had they been able to find a resource and then develop a power purchase agreement with the utility. So there are independent power producers both within the state and then from outside of the state that can come in. And the percentage right now is small.
Along the same lines on power purchase agreements, Ben May with Anchorage Solar, it seems that power purchase agreements for things like community solar have been pretty problematic. And so how do you see the ERO and eventually maybe the independent system operator clearing the way or helping to create a better environment for PPAs?
For PPAs for community solar?
Yeah.
Like a nonprofit.
I'm not sure. I do think that if we have this new forum, a new electric reliability organization forum, then it could be the place where we address those issues. I mean, I guess I'm saying I don't know what the exact answer to that would be, except that we would have a forum. We'd have a forum to talk about things like net metering and, you know, the issue that we've got right now where the administrative net metering only requires the utilities to buy back up to 1.5% of their load. Homer, as you know, has just increased that voluntarily to 3%. But those would be examples, I think, of issues that this new forum could talk about. Because right now there is no real regional forum to talk about that and develop those kinds of regional rules. Anything that has to do with electric vehicles would also be something that this forum could, I mean, vis-a-vis the electric system they could talk about. And I failed to mention the IPP that is now selling to Matnisco Electric. So there's a solar IPP that's selling solar power now to Matnisco Electric.
So just for folks who haven't been following the Chugach community solar proposals closely, Chugach did propose a community solar project, and part of the reason why the Regulatory Commission rejected it is because the way that it was constructed for their proposal is that it would give differential treatment for members, which has been one of the biggest barriers for cooperatives adding, you know, EV type stuff to their new initiatives, as well as this community solar. So there are different ways to structure that through the actual utility itself. But there are also, I think that the, you know, with Siri creating these wind projects and then having pancaking rates to the grid, where as you sell from one co-op up through the rest, it no longer becomes financially feasible. So there are a lot of barriers to entry, and I think the PPAs, I'm not sure if they could be addressed, but hopefully that would be the right forum for them. As well as all these other, you know, issues that are preventing a lot of movement that utilities have shown that they're excited about, as well as a lot of other folks in communities.
Thanks. I can't help but ask another question, because I'm struck by this timeline from 86 to almost 2020, 34 years, and like, what's the cost of inaction? Some of these things look like they're iterations from a previous life, a new acronym, kind of like a new administration comes in, they have new policies, and then this can go on for a long time. But I was wondering, especially with the connection agreements for independent power and renewable energy, and maybe the upgrade of the transmission system as a whole, whether there's an opportunity cost to just sitting on our hands and saying we're going to live with what we've got. And what strikes me is, I think I got this right, that Chugach announced that its consumers in the cooperative were going to be paying 3 to 6% more on their bills until the power lines came back on to get the Bradley Lake power, which was being spilled. So if you're in Homer and you have it all to yourself, it sounds great, but for the Railbelt as a whole, it's not great news. And I don't know if we're talking about thousands of dollars or millions of dollars, but it seems like the inability to have redundancy and get the power where you need it has cost us some money. And yet there's still all of these iterations with transcos and what we're going to invest and when we're going to invest it, but when we don't, it costs us millions of dollars. And I think the same argument could be made with economic dispatch, that if we could have saved $50 million and put that in the pockets of ratepayers, while we're talking about raising some revenue for something in the state's budget crisis, I'd say every $50 million counts. That's just my thinking. So comments, critique?
I would agree there's definitely economic cost to inaction. I don't know exactly how you would calculate what they are. If we had planning, for instance, and siting authority 10 years ago, we probably wouldn't have spent $1.5 billion on natural gas generation. We may have spent less. We may have spent more on renewables. We may have spent more on transmission. And that's one thing we haven't talked about too much tonight, but the commission, Regulatory Commission, is also interested in having some entity that's in charge of the whole transmission system. Because right now, nobody is in charge of the whole transmission system, and therefore, it's not as robust or redundant as it could be. And that's going to be an issue that has to be dealt with when we talk about this idea of economic dispatch, because for good reason, people in Homer and Fairbanks are a little bit more nervous about having economic dispatch when there's not redundancy on power lines between those endpoints on the grid. It's a lot easier, I think, for the folks who live in the Anchorage and Matsu area to talk about power pooling and economic dispatch right now, because our transmission systems are more robust here at the core. So there's a lot of issues that we failed to deal with, but it's not just that. I mean, the fact is we've all been relying on the state and oil revenues forever, and we haven't set up a mechanism to pay for some of these things earlier. We could have done that, but we just were fat and happy and said, okay, we'll just have the oil revenues come in until they didn't.
Yeah, I would say it's not only an economic cost. Ultimately, it's an environmental and a human cost, right? So thinking about this big picture, what does it mean that Fairbanks has been burning so much coal and oil for decades, right? What does that mean for the health of the people in our communities? And on a macro scale, you know, what is the cost of that additional carbon pollution that has been changing the chemistry of our atmosphere and our oceans? You know, in some sense, it's almost unknowable in our lifetimes. But as we are beginning to think about what type of cost we should put on a ton of carbon, I mean, that begins to answer the question of these mounting and cumulative environmental costs from our inaction to get away from fossil fuels. And the other thing I'd say that we should really be concerned with is this concept of fossil lock-in. The issue is when you build these infrastructures, when you put money into these resources, from an economic perspective, it makes sense to keep utilizing those assets. So what are the long-term implications of this $1.5 billion of natural gas capacity that we've built out in the state? How long are we going to keep using that, you know, even when there's a period in time when we know that we shouldn't be using it, but it makes economic sense to? And the final thing that I'd say is, you know, we really need to be concerned about stranded assets, because the more we are transitioning over to renewable sources that are cheaper, that are cleaner, that are the direction that the world is going, you know, we do not want to have these legacy fossil assets that are getting us, you know, locked into not only a dirty future, but basically an unprofitable one because of the economic nature of renewable energy sources.
I got a question about the Bradley Lake. So is that basically, if you could sort of tell us a little bit about it, if it's going to be overfull or lost power due to the down intertie, and ultimately who's responsible for getting the intertie? I guess it's burned up from the Swan Lake fire, right? And so who's responsible to rebuild that, and how long is that likely to take?
Go ahead.
The sectional line is down as a Homer Electric line. So Homer Electric is responsible at this point in time for restoring service to that facility. So we're all working with Homer. We've all offered their resources and all sorts of help and aid to assist them in getting it back up. They filed a status with the commission, which they just did, I think, yesterday. So if you want to go to that exciting RCA website, you can look up their last filing, which does sort of indicate that they're not in a hurry to put it back up, but we're working with them.
Thanks, Ed.
It's a state-owned resource.
State of Alaska.
State of Alaska owns the energy, owns the project. Do you foresee any more mergers among the utilities, and do you think that would be helpful?
I haven't heard that co-ops are excited to have larger regions that they are serving for which they're serving members. I think that this RRC is a really exciting development where, you know, there's more pooling of resources just because there's more talk of planning. But if you've heard of something, I'd love to know about it.
I haven't heard about it, but it seems it reduces friction when you have different economic drivers and ownership among the utilities. And if you merge, it'd be easier to do the right thing.
Well, I think that's what we're hoping to do with things like this RRC and hopefully either a unified or an independent system operator. From a democratic perspective, I'm really happy with my co-op, and I'm really happy that we have democratic engagement with them. And I worry about what would a larger co-op look like, right? Would that reduce opportunities for democratic engagement? I'm really happy that I can, speak with my board members and go to these meetings, and there's a lot of avenues and on-ramps for engagement. And what I'd like to actually see more than a merger in the state of Alaska is I'd like to see more member owners getting involved with their co-ops, pushing their board members to embrace renewables. And so I know that's a slightly different direction than what you're headed for, but I hope that these types of institutional arrangements that we've been working so hard for will help reduce those sources of friction that you're talking about.
I'd also say the NLMP and Chugach merger was talked about for at least 30 years. So if stuff's just in the works,
cooperative ownership over IPP. I think there's a place for both. And down in Juneau, they have Vista. Juneau's grid down there has always been privately owned by the Alaska Electric Company, which was a family-owned entity for like 100 years, literally. And they recently got bought out by Northwest Utility. But one of the things that they're allowed to do is they offer an electric car tariff down in Juneau. And from 10 p.m. till 5 a.m., they'll sell you electricity if you get a special meter for 5.5 cents a kilowatt hour. It's hydro-based, but there's over like 265 Leafs, Nissan Leafs electric cars in Juneau, and it's just kind of neat that they can do that. If a co-op tried to do a tariff like that, as someone mentioned earlier, the RCA might get on our case for giving a preferential right or something like that. The RCA really keeps an eye on the little old lady at the end of the cul-de-sac and making sure that the tariffs and everything are always equal to everyone. So it's a complex issue, but just worth mentioning the independent power producer and the great business structure of cooperatives and everything these guys are saying about engaging your cooperative and showing up at the meetings. We're really lucky in Alaska that we have the 1964 Co-op and Electric Co-op bylaw or Co-op Act that basically says all co-op meetings are open to the public. You have cooperatives down in the lower 48 where members can't show up to the meetings. I mean, imagine that. And really, I think all of our Railbelt electric cooperatives, I go to meetings all over the nation, we are really a gold standard when it comes to transparency, member engagement, and things like that. Luckily, we have a great constitution, and we have some laws that back up our co-op. But we're really light years ahead of some of the co-ops down in the lower 48. So you should be happy that we have this structure, and it's really easy to engage with your electric cooperatives in Alaska, and I urge you to do so.
Yeah, I'd riff off of you, Tom. Thanks for being here tonight. I would say this, as FCAC, as a climate justice organization, we are fundamentally interested in community ownership of our assets, right? So we are starting from this place that is above so many others in the lower 48. I mean, again, look what's happening right now in California. They are talking about, what's going to happen with PG&E. There are a lot of people who want to make that into a co-op or they want to municipalize that power, right? And that's an extraordinary fight that they have to put forward. To do that, we're already starting from an elevated place because we have community ownership of our energy assets, and that's democratic ownership, right? When it comes to the IPPs, I would say let there be competition, right? Let's compete for who can get the lowest renewable energy prices on the grid, because ultimately what we need moving forward isn't any type of silver bullet, right? We need a plurality of solutions. And so I would love to see it up in Fairbanks if we had multiple solar and wind producers who are vying to put that renewable electricity onto the grid. And yeah, let there be competition, but ultimately I agree with you, Tom, that I like our communally owned resources and our democratically owned assets that are not fundamentally oriented towards profit, but are fundamentally oriented towards providing reliable and safe power for the people.
I'd also like to put a quick plug-in as the Energy Education Director at REAP. I work with every single utility on the Railbelt for energy education outreach, so that's another piece of that too.
Great, well that about wraps up our time here. Thank you everybody for being here. Thank you to our panelists. I think if you want to know more, if you want to learn more, if you want to get more involved, everybody up here is a phone call or an email away. November 18th if you're an MEA member in Wasilla, Bear Paw Brewery. And then we'll be back here November 21st to discuss tidal energy. And yeah, thank you all for coming, and a big round of applause for our panelists.
You weren't smiling.